Give us the scoop. You're currently in New York. It seems like you've been in New York. Did you grow up there? And then how did you end up in this crazy world of startups and companies?
Yeah, so I'm actually in the Bay Area. I don't live in New York. I live in the Bay. The company is out west, but it's out west because of what we do, and it doesn't make sense to be in New York. But I'll start from the beginning. So I grew up in Florida. I went to the University of Florida, had an amazing experience. College was great. Late 90s. It was kind of like the pre-internet age. There was internet, but not really. And so everything was really done manually. I started my first business in college, gave me the entrepreneurial bug. It was a magazine, actually, where I effectively redid the Career Resource Center in the form of a magazine to help people get jobs, organize the college career fairs, and then ended up moving to New York. I lived in New York for about 20 years, half the time in finance, half the time in tech. New York was going through this amazing renaissance period where tech was booming. It was so exciting. There was this energy in the city and neighborhoods were transforming. Flatiron and Chelsea were all turning into this tech hub. And I started a bunch of different companies. Most of them failed, but my last one, which was called Vettery, worked and it scaled, and we were, friends and close with a lot of the other startups in that period of time, like Pelotons and Warbies and Rent the Runway and Jet.com and WeWork and all those type of companies. But ultimately sold the company and used the money to all start Archer and had a really fun journey, but happy to dive in wherever.
Yeah, let's double click a little bit. So for your companies prior to Vettery, were they venture backed? Did you bootstrap them? And then what about Vettery, which was obviously your first winner?
Maybe I'll take you back even further. I moved to New York in 2001. And my first job was actually an investment banking job. And I was an investment banker at Merrill Lynch. If you go back a couple of years when I was in college, I didn't even know what investment banking was. But I found out what it was. And I was interested only because it was viewed as the most competitive job to get out of college. And more importantly, it wasn't a job that was really meant for college kids that went to state schools. It was all very Ivy League. And I was a big outsider and I had a huge chip on my shoulder and would break down any barrier that was in front of me. And so I loved that challenge of trying to get that job. And so I ended up getting the job through crazy stories that I had to go through to get it. But I ended up getting that job and I moved to New York. I live Chambers and west of the West Side Highway. And I go through the 2-month investment banking training program. It's a lot of fun. There were 200 analysts. So it was a big
Oh my
group
gosh.
coming out of the tech boom. And my second day of work was 9/11. So I'm walking to work and literally the first plane flies over my head and into the building that was connected to the building I was working in. So I was working in the World Financial Center and that was in the World Trade Center. My investment banking experience was not typical. It was very much one of chaos and really as a new employee in the workforce to try to figure out like what was going on. I literally remember standing there looking at the World Trade Center on fire and calling my dad and being like, Dad, I've got this crazy job that on this journey I've been on, and the building next to mine's on fire. Am I supposed to go to work? Bankers work no matter what. I mean, it was the craziest day probably of my life. So I ended up through my journeys in finance, meeting some incredible people on the hedge fund side. And so I ended up going to work for a fund that was 2 guys and a very little amount of money. They were 3 years older than me at the time. I was 25, they were 28. And we ended up scaling that business. Really, I should say they ended up scaling that business. I was an analyst and having a good time learning to a pretty big size fund, like a big player in the space. But it was very entrepreneurial. It's not like it is today. The hedge fund space today is very institutionalized and it's very systematic. Back then, it was full Wild West. You could do whatever you wanted, invest in any asset class, anytime, any size. There was kind of no rules. It was a bunch of young people figuring out and breaking down doors the same way I feel like I had broken down the door to get into that first finance job. And then the same way now, I feel like what I do now is very entrepreneurial, trying to break down new industries. Very similar type of thing. And the guy I worked for taught me an incredible amount, but a lot of his philosophies and lessons were all about really trying to understand how the world really works and how to find value. And so it shaped a lot of the ways that how I think today, and ultimately how I ended up getting into the aviation business in this crazy world of eVTOLs that I'm in now, was really trying to understand true contrarian thinking and be willing to go for it. That really set me up. I ended up then working on a website that kind of told a lot of my journey, a lot of my story, and that really kind of morphed into building products because I had this blog with lots of traffic where we had lots of interesting users, and then could effectively take that web traffic and showcase different products and try things out. Part of my philosophy, not a unique comment, but a philosophy that I buy into, is that there are features, products, and companies. And we were very much feature stage, and maybe we were product, but we certainly were not a company. And so many of those features, I'll call it, just didn't really scale. And so it was a really interesting way to learn about how to build products and how to build technology and how to recruit and how to raise capital, all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, none of them were really actually companies until I hit Vettery. And Vettery was the first one that actually really worked. It scaled. And so not knowing what product market fit is and then hitting product market fit is very obvious if you've done it. I think we did it 6 times, failed each time, and then finally found product market fit and then actually scaled Vettery. Vettery was, I think, a great success for I'll call myself a first-time entrepreneur then, even though we had been through lots of stuff in history, but really like a thing that actually was working and scaling. But it really was a really fun experience to get to that.
Where did the idea come from for Vettery?
So the original website that I had built with my partner at the time was really about our story of breaking into this job of finance in this high finance world, and then taking that same philosophy and kind of extrapolating that to some other sectors and subsectors of here's how you can go do that kind of thing. And it just drove a lot of web traffic. We were really good at identifying keywords that Google would rank very highly, and it wasn't that competitive in the space we were doing it. And so because we had like a job-oriented type of setup, it allowed us to start building products in the job space. So an example was everything was going mobile at one point. And it was like, okay, well, none of the websites, especially job websites, were optimized for mobile. So if you wanted to apply to a job on your phone, you get this big screen shrunken down and you're trying to like fill out your resume on a phone. It doesn't work. And so you can build OAuth features from LinkedIn and suck down social profiles and lots of different things that you can do to help make it a much better experience. So there were things like that that were very good ideas. Like it was like made perfect sense, but it didn't work as a company necessarily. And so the concepts around finding jobs evolved as I was building features or products and not really turning them into companies, knowing when to pivot when it was time that this wouldn't really scale, and then ultimately going and trying the next one. Vettery was an evolution. Vettery was not a direct like, hey, let's go try this. Vettery was a result of many, many failures to lead to one that worked. And after you pivoted 6 times, like who cares on the 7th one, you're used to pivoting. Pivoting is a very hard thing because most people are not willing to do it because it's your baby that you built and you put so much hours into just destroy it. So it was an evolution. But because of my past, I was able to raise money from people who knew me. And so I was not your typical, back then it was like, well, did you go to Stanford? Did you work at Google? It was like a very, like the Silicon Valley funded companies were a pretty particular profile. And I was not that profile, but hey, that's my whole life. That's what I've always been, is I've never been the right profile. And so same thing today, I'm not the typical aviation founder, but that type of setup was a fun challenge. So I raised money from some non-traditional people and then used that to start, and then was just very tactical in making sure we could not burn through it, make a real business, and really stretch those funds.
Did you end up raising from your traditional VCs for Vettery before the acquisition?
So there was one, I'll call it traditional VC that first started. There was a guy named Rick Zullo who was working out of Chicago who had met us, and he was
equal.
Now equal, yeah. So he was one of the first guys from a VC that said, "Wow, actually these are like smart people, and this might make sense," and willing to take a bet. And so he worked at Lightbank at the time, and so he was great. And then another guy named Will Zerbiak, who was at Greycroft at the time. Rick brought the deal to Will, and then Will really believed in it too. And then Will brought in Ian Sigalo, who was the co-founder of Greycroft. And they really liked the concept. In the end, the way I think it always is they just ended up betting on like the people like me, and then rather than the idea. And it was just to force. There's certain people that will force an idea to work no matter what it is, and that's kind of was the mentality. We will make this work no matter what. And what I believed was the company we're building, this marketplace concept, it really was like a CAC business, right? It was all about acquisition and managing acquisition cost of the items we would put on our marketplace. In our case, it was candidates. So candidate acquisition cost was the whole game. We had a big competitor called Hired. Hired.com was the big competitor. They had raised over $100 million. We raised $9 million, and we effectively put them out of business, ended up acquiring them at the end for nothing, effectively assuming their debt. And it was all because we were very efficient in how we ran the unit economics of the business. And maybe that was just because at the time in New York, the money was not as free flowing as it was on the West Coast. And so we protected those dollars.
Yeah, I hope founders are listening and taking notes. The market is still interesting, and I wish more folks were focused on unit economics. What made you sell this? And did you already have the idea for Archer, so it was time?
So Vettery was such a fun cultural experience. We hired, like when we started scaling, we built the first, like, our SDR team, our sales team, our enterprise sales team. There was at one point, like, I don't know, 150 or so, like between 22 and 26-year-olds, like working at Vettery out of the 200 something people. And so it was like a very young, fun company. People would get Vettery tattoos, which we banned. We said, no tattoos, like stop. This is like, it's fun, but it's like, that's permanently on your body. We had to like ban, like everyone was like smoking Juul at the time because they were one of our big clients. It was like this party kind of like thing. And it was all working too, and it was scaling. And so it's always fun to be part of one of those things that can really build. But it was a brutal business. What we did as a company, just so you get the perspective, is we would take the best candidates that existed and almost like put a reverse job board. So we would showcase candidates, and then the companies would come and they would effectively request interviews with the candidates. But in order to request an interview, you had to say, here's how much comp we'd pay roughly, here's what the company idea is, and you'd match up these candidates with these companies. The reason why the candidates would do that, it's very interesting to see 20, 30 companies say, hey, I'd interview you and I'd pay 200 grand. Oh, I'd interview, I'd pay 500 grand. And across Series seed to public companies would do this. So the better the candidate, the more attractive they are on the platform. So it attracted really attractive candidates. So it all just worked. But it is an incredible grind. And the scalability of it, I think, was really tough. Along the way, I had met the head of corp dev from the Adecco Group, which is the biggest staffing company in the world. And they were looking for something interesting. So we initially started talking to them about investing in the business, which turned into more of an acquisition kind of conversation. But it was a really interesting fit. And so I've kind of explained the story to many founders. Like selling a company isn't necessarily what you think. And so a lot of it has to do with really making sure you're in the sort of the path of progress of these companies. There are real champions and they're happening. So what was going on at Adecco at the time was there was a lot of pressure from Wall Street for them to get involved in HR tech, and they were not necessarily investing a ton. And so they did not want to go bet the house on it, but they wanted to invest something. So we were a really nice tuck-in size acquisition, $110 million. It wasn't too much because they were a big $10+ billion market cap company. It wasn't too big where it would hurt their earnings, but it would be a big drag on their metrics because it was a very metrics expense-centric company. But at the same time, it was big enough where it wasn't like 10 million where nobody would really care. So they could kind of like show us off as, hey, this new hot tech company, but at the same time, not really have to spend too much money. So it was perfect. It worked for everybody because they saw growth in it. It wasn't too big and they could try it out. And that's really kind of the real reason why they wanted to buy it. And when you're going through this and how hard the businesses are and you get offered a lot of money, it's very tempting to go do that. And especially in a grinder business like that. But for me, the lesson was I wanted to be in a bit, if I'm going to do it again, because startups are so brutally hard. The lashes on my back are so deep, right? It's like every founder has some type of brutal story. It's not easy for anybody. If I'm going to do it again, I want to build a product that is so good that if we can build the tech, it'll sell itself. And that was the different philosophy I had, where I did not want to be in the monthly sales game where I'm grinding it all down for some virtual product you can't see and touch. I love the concept of hardware that you can have an emotional connection to the product, which allowed me to start thinking different about working on something new.